Let's review the week one reflection questions. Question one: describe the difference between identifying an argument and evaluating one. Well, to identify an argument, in identifying an argument, we are simply trying to decide whether it is actually an argument, as opposed to some other form of language. So, identifying an argument is not saying whether it's good or bad. Identifying an argument is simply saying whether it actually constitutes an argument of any sort, as opposed to evaluating an argument, which is basically saying whether it's good or bad, whether it's a good argument or a bad argument. So they're two different things. Number two, how does our author define argument? And that would be how to identify them. He says different things, but I think his best definition is here. An argument is a set of statements, some of which, the premises, attempt to provide a reason for thinking that some other statement, the conclusion, is true. So, arguments have premises, at least one, and they have a conclusion. And the premises are meant to support the conclusion or give a reason for thinking that the conclusion is true. Three, what is a premise? All arguments have at least one premise and probably more. Premises of the argument provide a reason for thinking that the conclusion is true. So we identify premises by, first of all, saying that there actually is reasoning going on. And then we sort of look for the two sides of that. Whenever we're reasoning in terms of providing an argument, there's something to be proved. And then there's the way that we prove it. And the premises are the way that we prove it. So the premises of the argument provide a reason for thinking that the conclusion is true. Premises are not the point of the argument. The point of the argument is the conclusion. Premises are reason for thinking that that point is actually true. How does our Number four, how does our author suggest we can identify an argument? And he says the best way to identify whether an argument is present is to ask whether there is a statement that someone is trying to establish as true by basing it on some other statement. If so, then there's an argument present. If not, then there isn't. If I say a single statement, Phillies are the best team in baseball, that is not an argument. That is a statement. If I start to try to support that claim, the Phillies are the best team in baseball, by making a bunch of other statements which are clearly intended to give us reason to think that the main point is true, then I have an argument. So really, we have to use our reading knowledge. Ask ourselves whether there's a statement that someone's trying to establish, and whether they're trying to establish by basing it on some other statements. Number five, why is it that an argument requires at least two separate statements? Well, that's an interesting thing to note, that an argument has to have a conclusion and it has to have at least one premise supporting it, so it has to have at least two statements. So a single statement can never be an argument in itself. There have to be at least two statements to make an argument. Number six, what is the difference between a main conclusion and an intermediate conclusion? There's I didn't find a couldn't find a capsule definition, but he sort of defines it along the way in this passage. He's talking about an argument, and he says, so the main conclusion A is directly supported by B, and B is supported by C. Right? So that tells you that B is the intermediate conclusion. Why? Well, since B acts as a premise for the main conclusion, but is also itself the conclusion of further premises, we refer to B as an intermediate conclusion. The important thing to recognize here is that one and the same statement can act as both a premise and a conclusion. Statement B is a premise that supports the main conclusion, but it is also itself a conclusion that follows from C. So the main conclusion of any argument is the point of the argument, the thing that is most important, the thing that the argument is trying to establish. An intermediate conclusion is one of the premises for that main conclusion, but it itself is supported by reasoning. So it's a conclusion along the way to the main conclusion, the intermediate conclusion. Most complex arguments, or an argument is complex, and most arguments are complex when they have intermediate conclusions. That is, intermediate conclusions are premises that support the main conclusion. But we may feel the need to argue for them. So they become like little sub arguments or sub conclusions on the way to the main conclusion. Finally, number seven, how do I know whether my paraphrases of an argument are good? He doesn't really explain this. I mean, he doesn't really give us a good criterion for that. He says that I know my paraphrase, and paraphrasing is when we have to reword the argument to make it fit into standard form, which sometimes can make it sound stilted and things like that. But in order to bring out the logic of it, we need to change the wording. How do I know that my changes in wording don't change meaning, don't change the argument? He says, well, I know that my paraphrase is good if it captures the essence of the logic of the argument. But that just leads to the question, how do I know whether I've captured the essence of the logic of it, logical essence of an argument, I guess. So it's totally circular. you know, I mean, he should just admit that. There's nothing wrong with it. It is totally circular. How do you know that your paraphrases of an argument are good? You just have to have a sense of it and be very careful and ask yourself whether your paraphrase is, in fact, making the same argument as the original wording. There's no rule for that. You just have to use your intuition about the meanings of words and really your intuitions about logic. Ask yourself whether the paraphrase of the original argument makes the same point and makes it in the same way, that is, relies on the same premises or the same reasoning. I don't think there's any definite way to do that. You just have to sort of muddle along.